Yeah, welcome back to SoccerX Connected 100. Big thanks to Mick McCarthy as well, in great form. Lovely to see Mick. The content comes thick and fast today. Before we move on, remember we've got a competition we'd love you to get involved in. Real Betis and Valencia, brand new home shirts, 21-22 season. Dead easy to enter. So easy, I'm going to tell you how to do it. Let us know on Twitter and LinkedIn using the hashtag SoccerXConnected100 the best bit of transfer business your club's ever done, the profit perhaps you made, and we'll announce the winners on Twitter a bit later on. Also, if you've been with us throughout the summer, Jeff Thomas, former Palace and England player, has been raising thousands for Cure Leukemia, which is the SoccerX associated charity this summer. Jeff completed he did the Tour de France on his bike, unbelievable. And you can support him with a silent auction. We've got some absolutely amazing prizes, amazing giveaways, amazing lots, I think is the best way to call it, up for grabs. Head over to our auction page on Swapcard for your chance to win Harry Kane's signed boots, a trip to the Masters, and a host of other memorabilia, all in support of Cure Leukemia, supporting Jeff Thomas. Absolutely fantastic. Well done, Jeff. Very, very proud of you. Okay, on to the next panel. The topic is around investment in the game, how big business minds and learns from the US and minds from the US can come in and help professionalize football clubs, modernize them, and get them running like clockwork. Here's our panel. Luke Bourne, Chief Scientist at Zelus Analytics and Red Band Capital. Ilya Kainzig, Managing Director at VFL Bochum. Paul Conway, the owner of Barnsley and Nancy and co-founder of Pacific Media Group. And leading the discussion, the Chairman of the Board at Helsingborg FC, Mr. Jordan Gardner. Jordan, it's over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. Really appreciate it. And thanks for the guys for taking the time and joining. As Rob mentioned, today's panel, we're going to discuss the trend of private equity investment in European football. We're going to discuss some of the operational issues and challenges that these investors face. What are their long-term goals and plans? We'll also get a German perspective on new trends in the Bundesliga, including potential changes to the 50+1 ownership structure. So we'll take your questions too, so feel free to send those through. And as time allows, I'll try to get answers from the panelists on that. So let's first start with Paul. Paul, you have ownership stakes, if I'm not mistaken, in 5 countries, including most recently jumping into Denmark, which is a market I'm obviously very familiar with. What is your kind of general investment thesis with the portfolio of clubs you have, and what challenges have you faced in various markets throughout Europe?
Well, we've invested in 6 clubs in 5 years with the basic thesis that most European clubs are undermanaged, both from a recruiting, commercial side, fan engagement, and then just general business operations. And so we immediately implement change within all the clubs. So the biggest focus is always first on the recruiting side, and we're data driven. And we also have a big commitment to youth. We usually have the youngest team relatively quickly in the leagues we compete with, because it's the quickest way for us to start improving our investment returns, or if we don't do a good job, having a negative impact. And that's some of the biggest issues in European football, all the leakage around the way squads are managed. But then at the same time, we're focused on the commercial operations and bringing more American style practices that have worked for a long time in America to basically improve the revenue and sustainability of the club, which then gets reinvested in the squad and the academy, which will then hopefully make us more competitive that next season. But then we also focused on fan engagement to try to basically get more stickiness with our fans, and which ultimately usually runs into some additional revenue back into the squad again to help make us more competitive.
Luke, moving on to you. So your group manages the day-to-day operations at Toulouse in France. So what kind of challenges have you guys faced, obviously, with the issues going on at in French football on the league level? How has that experience been, and how does that look for you guys?
Yeah, certainly in France, we've hit a lot of a lot of hurdles over the last year. Obviously, the media deal sort of blowing up, and other COVID, of course, which everyone faced. Sort of stepping back from France, though, our group looked at probably 40, 50 clubs over the last few years, and just sort of iterating on what Paul said. For the most part, these clubs are not efficiently run businesses. So a lot of the times you're looking at the club and saying, well, what actually, if this thing was just run somewhat competently, what would it look like? And so, we saw a lot of clubs where, they didn't have a budget. So that you'd say, well, how do you decide what you spend in a year? And their answer would be, well, we just sort of do what we always do. And when we run out of money, the owner just wires in more. That's sort of their process for determining how much they spend. So, luckily when we took over Toulouse, it had great ownership before us. They had good sort of financial sort of control in place. We were able to go in there pretty confident that we knew what we were inheriting in sort of a team that had just been relegated. Very not a dissimilar thesis from Paul. This idea of, hey, we can come in here, we can run a sustainable club, and use some of our advancements and sort of what we think is an edge in the transfer market to ultimately improve the squad and put a better product on the pitch.
So when you guys were doing diligence, looking at the 40 to 50 clubs, what were the characteristics you guys were looking at? Were you looking at from more clubs that were kind of well run, where you guys can come in and just be a value add? Were you looking for clubs that were kind of distressed? What were you guys looking at?
I personally tend to lean more in the latter. I tend to think, not to buy the nicest house on the block. For the most part, we think of what we do as improved operational expertise. And so ultimately, we want to find, in some sense, distressed assets, clubs where maybe there's financial concerns, they're not being very well run, the fans are maybe disillusioned with the current owner. You can come in and say, look, we're going to come in, we're going to just be very methodical and strategic and sort of put the club on a sustainable path to growth. And so we look up and down the spectrum from sort of Champions League clubs all the way down to sort of third division and below, and we continue to. And but the thesis continues to be sort of find clubs where we can actually bring genuine operational advantage.
Got it. Looping Ilya in, looking at Germany, obviously, I think Germany has a reputation that the clubs are generally well run. How is that true? What kind of challenges have you guys faced? And obviously, with the unique ownership structure in Germany, clubs might not have access to the kind of private capital that other countries might have access to. So, what does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Jordan. I think to explain the German situation or the German model, I have to digress a little bit quickly and to start with what is the business of football. I mean, at the top end, it's entertainment, and at the middle and lower end, it's capitalizing emotions and producing talents. And football is a specific business, and theory and practice are totally different, as we have seen in the case of the Super League disaster. So for investors, I think it's about optimizing the way clubs are run, and while safeguarding the culture of a specific club. And the only money doesn't win you trophies or games. Only data doesn't win it either. Same with experience. So investors have to create a good mix. And we have three categories. You have, said, value football as part of the entertainment industry. That's interesting for private equity groups, for institutional investors, and they may well take out dividends. You have clubs at the intersection between value and growth, football clubs as commodities, applying a private equity model, taking out dividends. We see ownership groups like yours or Paul's. And then we have the growth category, where football, in my opinion, is seen and shall be safeguarded as the people's sport. And that's the case for Germany. And so most clubs or all clubs are looking for rather strategic partners with the aim of or accepting that the only aim is to increase the enterprise value. And so in my opinion, this will be rather individuals targeting these traditional mid-size clubs and willing to finance the existing business model. And the most interesting opportunities, said they are at the intersection maybe between value and growth, between the people sport and football clubs as commodities, between where tradition is combined with innovation and is well balanced. And I think that is the current spirit in German club football, to find these strategic partners which differ a lot of the ownership groups where clubs are maybe considered as commodities and new business models are introduced. So it's unique, and it might change, although I'm skeptic, but I'm sure we'll come back to that later, to the developments in connection with 50+1.
So looking specifically at your club, you guys won two Bundesliga last year and got promoted to the Bundesliga. What keys to success, I guess, could you point to in saying these are the things we've done right, and this is how this could replicate at other clubs?
I think in general, the German football could claim for itself a lot of USPs. The new TV deal is signed, which these days is a competitive advantage on the international stage, as we see with the situation in other countries like in France. You have a solidarity among first and second division clubs, which is unseen in the rest of Europe. So the league is marketed jointly, and all the decisions are taken jointly. Each club has one voice, and we try to find agreements unanimously. And German football in general has been healthy, or is healthy. Now, of course, Corona has done some damage, but before Corona, it was healthy, and it will be healthy again. And last but not least, the Task Force Future, founded by the German Football League, which will look at financial fair play, at sustainable growth and fan dialogue. And German football has the potential to become a leader in these categories. So strong USPs, and this, my opinion, makes up for the fact that we have the 50+1 rule, that you can only own a minority stake. And this 50+1 rule is also creating a more or less balanced competition. And we have examples of clubs which achieved major success without investors, like Gladbach qualifying for the Champions League, or Union Berlin qualifying for Europe, and clubs like Augsburg, Mainz, Freiburg establishing themselves in the Bundesliga for more than 10 years now. So the 50+1 rule might look as a big hurdle, or a hurdle you cannot overcome. But if you take a closer look, it might be even in an investor's, in a strategic partner's interest. It's maybe very extreme, this view, but I said, combined with the USPs you have in German football, this is something a potential strategic investor might see that way.
So Paul and Luke, speaking of Germany, is that a market you guys are both looking at? Are you waiting to see kind of how the dust settles on the 50+1 structure, if that changes, or what? How do you guys look at the German market?
Yeah, we're absolutely focused on Germany, because we run our clubs in a German manner. And I think some of the biggest improvement we've made in the last 3-4 years is going to a uniform style of play for all the clubs. And it's a high press, counter press, and the best coaches we can usually find are German speaking, usually German or Austrian. So strategic is very important to us to invest in Germany. And so we're evaluating a variety of opportunities, both because we think Germany on its own is interesting, but then for the group, it's very strategic.
Yeah, in our case, it's the same as Paul, where we've looked at Germany. We've approached Toulouse sort of thinking of this not just as a business, but partially as a community asset, and sort of working really closely with our supporters. And so, going into Germany just fits that model. It's sort of ingrained into the culture from day one with the 50+1 rule. So fits really well with the way we think about things.
So I know Paul's group is big into using data. Obviously, Luke, you're one of the smartest and savviest guys in this business, I think, on the data side. How did you guys modernize the use of data at Toulouse, and how do you look at the future of data in this industry?
Yeah, I come initially from North American sports, first in basketball, and then I spent some time at AS Roma, so I sort of had the experience of sort of seeing what it's like in baseball, basketball, and then also sort of seeing in soccer. And there's a few things to note there. First off, excuse me, people talk about soccer being 10 or 20 years behind in terms of the use of data, and that's true, but it's also well justified. We're at the point now in baseball and basketball where we can almost run a team entirely on data. The data at the pro level. In fact, a lot of MLB teams now, baseball teams, don't even have pro scouts because the data is so good. In the case of soccer, that's just not true. Even valuing center backs with data is still this black hole that no one really knows how to do it. So we're still at this point now where the quality of the data, the level of understanding with data in soccer is still far behind our understanding of other sports. But that doesn't mean there's not still tremendous inefficiencies in the game that you can get by just using very simple data, right? Oftentimes clubs will approach me that are saying, yeah, how do I use data? And I look at them and they're, if you look around Europe, most clubs have revenues of under 10 million. Obviously the highline clubs that are making 100 million plus get all the attention, but the vast majority of clubs around Europe are tiny. And so for them, it's actually really hard to say that data is a good approach when you think about the cost of acquiring the data, of sort of getting insights from it. If you have a revenue of 1 or 2 million a year, it's maybe not a good return on investment. But if you're a larger club, all it takes is sort of have impact one transfer to sort of have an impact of tens or even potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. So our approach has been at Toulouse us to identify players that are undervalued in the market that are going to ultimately help us win, right? And I think we're sort of at the tipping point of where it's worth it. But again, to sort of reiterate, I think smaller clubs, even the NAS, have to sort of think a bit differently about data just because of the sort of cost of entry of actually doing it right.
Yeah, for you guys, Paul, is the data being used, obviously, I assume, beyond just recruitment? Is it player performance, health and wellness, or is it just strictly on recruitment?
We have separate data team on the performance side, but I think most of the capital commitment really is on the recruiting. And we don't have any physical scouts for any of the clubs. We have analysts. And I think our biggest improvement really has been in the last 3 years since we have a uniform style of play. Is 3 years ago, we were trying to utilize analytics to find the best undervalued players, similar to undervalued stocks. And our analysts would watch matches online looking for them. Now we're confident enough in the data that we know we have good players. And so the allocation of their time is more of watching a player and then seeing, can they fit that style of play? So putting another overlap of pressing analytics onto the general player analytics. But yeah, I think in the future, we definitely have to spend more capital on the performance side. But for all of our clubs, the most significant returns is really being generated through finding undervalued players.
Yeah. Ilya, looking at Germany, where do you see the use of data in Germany, both at your club and across German football? Do you see areas where there can be improvement? How does that look in that market?
I think it's being used, but it's not as much as you see it being used in England or in the US or with clubs owned by external investors. And because of that, you also have a lack of creativity, like you maybe see in Spain. German football has been very conservative in terms of transfers, and so data is definitely a potential. I mean, only one club gets regularly mentioned as mastering the art of using data. It's VfB Stuttgart, others less. And So there's potential there, and the resulting from that, I think, also potential to improve transfer business. I mean, we see the success at Dortmund. They balance competitiveness and buying low, selling high at the top end, but at the other clubs, transfer income has been maybe a bit neglected in the way as maybe commercial revenues in England, which rely a lot on the TV money. So there's a lot of potential there for German football to improve transfer business, generate real transfer revenues by really investing in this data approach in scouting and in signing players. So that's definitely a case. And data off the pitch is also something which maybe will bring benefits to German football when it will be used in terms of international sales, creation of a OTT platform, and generally in internationalization, globalization, selling German football abroad. Data will be also very relevant there. So there are interesting areas where you still have a lot of upsides for German football.
Yeah. If you have any questions for any of the panelists, feel free to send those through and I'll start asking those questions. Kind of circling back to our conversation about German ownership structure, I know there's been some meetings with the leadership of the German football clubs about changes to the 50+1 rule. Ilya, do you see changes happening? Do you think that's going to happen in the short term, long term? Where do you see that discussion going?
Well, we are at a very interesting point. We just had our extraordinary league assembly last week, and there are 3 exceptions to the 50+1 rule. It's 2 clubs owned by corporations, Bayer Leverkusen and VfL Wolfsburg, and 1 club with a private investor funding the club for more than 20 years, Hoffenheim. So these 3 clubs have an exception, and the German cartel office has noted that there's no problem with the 50+1 rule, as it serves the goal of having a balanced competition, but they have an issue with the exceptions. So the league has to come up with answers, with proposals, and the board is now working to find a solution which is acceptable to the 33 clubs not having an exception, and the 3 mentioned clubs, with the goal to safeguard 50+1. That was the general opinion last week. So even the few clubs which were fighting 50+1 in the past, they stayed put for the moment, and we will see in the coming weeks, or I think the date is mid-September or the end of September, where we will have a new picture, a new assessment of the situation, whether the proposed solution is acceptable to the cartel office, to the clubs, and then we would carry on with 50+1. I think that's the general feeling right now, and I think it won't change anytime soon, as you might know that the German league had a project to sell stake in a newly created company to private equity groups in the winter, last winter, and it was abandoned. And I think that was a sign that there's still hesitation about private equity entering German football. But at the same time, as I said earlier, strategic partners are welcome if there are any.
Yeah. So we have a first question came in from Neil. I think this is for both Luke and Paul. He asks, what makes private equity firms a good partner for football clubs? Do they take a long-term perspective, or in the cases, is it just get in, smarten up, and then sell for a profit? Obviously, this is a little bit generalized. It totally depends on the group. But from your perspective, what are kind of maybe the motivations of some of the private equity groups coming into European football?
Well, to specifically answer it, my private equity firms are actually not well aligned with football clubs because of the volatility of earnings and relegation and promotion. Private investors who have a longer time frame actually, I think, are well aligned because they can bring best practices that have worked in the sports industry and other places to implement and improve the sustainability of clubs. And what we find is the dispassionate, unemotional foreign investor can often come into a country and make really some hard changes and decisions that sometimes local investors have a tougher time doing because of the emotion around it.
Yeah, to build a bit on what Paul said, not all institutional investors are the same, right? Some of them have 3 to 5 year fund windows in terms of, that's how quickly they need to turn around their capital. Others have much longer, sort of 10 years. So you talk about the former, it's really hard to sort of institute best practices and sort of have a long-term vision if you have to flip the club in 3 years, right? And certainly there are groups doing that, but generally if you want to have, as Paul says, long-term success, you need sort of the small set of firms that have a longer vision, and that needs to be sort of on the scale of 5, 10 plus years.
We have another question came in from Jose. He said, we see patterns of investment and buying into certain leagues. We saw this with the English Championship. Where do you guys see the next hot market? Is it capitalizing on French football? We've talked a little bit about the Bundesliga. Where do you guys see the next emerging market? I could argue that Denmark has been a pretty hot market, I think, recently for foreign investment. Where do you guys see the next market?
Well, I think that you first start with where are there no foreign restrictions? And as you mentioned, Denmark, France, even Holland has recently opened up. Places where, and I think that's one of the negatives of Germany, is that the structure has to evolve because some of the biggest pushback on changing the rules are from clubs that have already been exempted from it. And for the same club to win the league 9 years in a row, that's not great. So it's basically where there's limited foreign ownership restrictions. Those will continue to consolidate.
Yeah, building on what Paul said, I think step one, you have to look at where it's possible to invest in clubs, and you're just not going to go into certain places. But look, people have talked about Denmark for a while. Denmark, and now at this point, if you look in the top 2 divisions, I think over half the clubs have been scooped up by foreign investment, right? Jordan, you'd know better than I do. So at this point, like Belgium and Denmark and even France, for the most part, have been, there's not sort of many clubs run by local mom and pop anymore. So, will it move to Asia, South America, farther east in Europe? It's still unknown.
Yeah, I've always said that I think there's massive opportunities in developing markets. Obviously, it's challenging to do business in many of these places, but I think you see American groups starting to go into Mexico. I think South America. I think there's some interesting opportunities there. Paul, I'm curious. You've looked at a lot of different markets. Do you see some markets kind of opening up where they've maybe in the past been more resistant to foreign investment? So Scotland, for instance, right? I think you guys looked at clubs there. I think most of us have looked at clubs there. There's been resistance to multi-club ownership there. Like, do you see that changing, or do you think it's kind of just going to be an old school way of doing?
Yeah, it's really market to market. Scotland is not changing, and anyone that has an interest in another club, is going to be near impossible to have any meaningful interest in a Scottish club. I think other countries are just opening up more just due to a need for capital and the impact of the pandemic. And so that doesn't mean Spain always comes up, and we've looked at a variety of opportunities there. It's hard often to get the right deals closed that we've done everywhere else. Everywhere else we've invested at less than 1 times revenue. And one of the reasons I think in some of these markets you don't see a significant amount of transactions is just because there's just this big bid and ask between what the local investors expect and what foreign, namely American investors, value of the clubs. I think more people are dipping their toes into Portugal and Italy. We're not comfortable in those markets just from a general rule of law perspective, and the difficulty of directly owning players in some of those markets. When you look at some of the clubs and American owners have gotten into it, and it's the first thing they've said, wait a minute, I don't own most of these players. So I think that will, over the next 5 years, as more people go for it in some of these markets, they're going to probably struggle, but then those that follow will benefit from their hard work and losses, frankly.
Paul, I'm really curious, something you said earlier about having a kind of distinct playing style throughout all your clubs. Do you find that if you look at a market, let's say Spain, where maybe the playing style is a little bit foreign, do you say, look, we have a unique way of playing, it doesn't matter what market we're in, it works, it's proven it works, or do you say we're going to stay away from certain markets because we don't think it's this high pressing style is going to work in this particular
so I can show you analytically that there are a few clubs in Spain that press. Ibar, I believe, is one, and they have success. So the style of play works in every market. The issue fundamentally is since we don't have currently an investment in a Spanish club, we don't really actively recruit there because it's a market that's a good market with good revenue and good wages. And many of the players that are coming into that market, Spanish speaking, want to remain in that market. So it's more of an opportunity of, we want to have a club in that market to better access the players in that market. And you can say the same thing for other countries. So,
got it. Question it's for Ilya from Jeff. He said, as a promoted club, where do you stand with foreign investment in German football? It's become a bad word after the Bundesliga turned away private equity. Where do you stand on the issue?
Yeah, I think the project competition, turning away from private equity, was the result of the Super League disaster. It fell in the same time period, and I think many, especially the big clubs, were afraid of proceeding in this moment. Maybe this could change in the near future, or in the mid-distant future. But as I said earlier, German football is specific and is looking for a specific investor profile. The so-called strategic partners accepting that there is a 50+1 rule, but also accepting a premium. The valuations, Paul mentioned it, are significant in Germany. But when you take a closer look and you note that it's not an owner selling, it's the members. So the proceeds are going straight into the asset and start working. And in front of that background, German football doesn't look too expensive, maybe also considering the other USPs mentioned before. But yeah, clubs are open and are actively looking for this strategic partner. They cannot sell a majority. They can culturally, I think, giving up control and allowing an investor to implement a totally new business model will be very difficult. So everybody is on the lookout for that individual willing to fund the current board, to finance the current business model, to assist the club in its project and have a very long-term vision. And it was a good remark by Paul, said that external investors, they can call more tougher shots than the local ones. And this will be interesting to see in case of the German market, because you just have one club with an investor which has no ties to the club itself. All other minority investors, they have some link. They are either from that region or they support that particular club. But the only project where you have really an external and distant investor is Hertha Berlin, and I think that is a project to watch and to see whether it's possible to satisfy capital despite 50+1 and despite all this unique conditions in the German market. and the first strategic partner arriving maybe will set the benchmark and open the gates for others to follow. So yeah, it might take some time maybe, but eventually I think focus will be on German market again.
And going back to the discussion earlier about kind of multi-club and connecting clubs, have you guys looked at any feeder clubs? I know a lot of the German clubs look to Austria. Have you guys looked at that, or you're obviously just focused on the club that you guys have?
No, right. The multi-club model is also maybe needs some time and adaptation. And the first one, maybe first strategic partner will be able to introduce that to German football. There are a lot of reservations, and one has to take a very sensitive approach in regards to that. But first German club now operating a so-called farm club model is Wolfsburg. They acquired a club in Austria, St. Pölten, and they will use this club instead of their reserve team, as they believe that the transfer value of players will raise much quicker and much higher than if you take them from your reserve team playing in the fourth or fifth division. So that might be a blueprint for other clubs, mainly big clubs who afford to really purchase a club abroad to use it for the second team.
We have a question in from Can. He said, and I think this is to Luke and Paul, are you guys mainly concentrating investing in Western European markets, or are emerging markets like Turkey and Poland also interesting? Where are the operational costs of running a club in a much lower comparing market to Western Europe? And some of these clubs obviously have huge fan bases. Can that be used to open up additional revenue streams beyond just player sales?
Of the two mentioned, Poland's interesting to us. Basically, our investment in clubs follows where we recruit. And if we're finding a big batch of undervalued talent in a particular country that can be helpful to our clubs, then we start looking at clubs in that country. So Poland's interesting for sure.
Do you feel, Paul, that you need to own a club in that market to have access, or can you just have access to the talent pool through your networks and through the data?
I mean, we have access to the players, but it's all about, can you save a derivative of value by getting some of these players one step earlier? So instead of paying whatever 700,000 for a player, can you then benefit as an investor through that local Polish club, if you're an investor in that club that sells that player to a foreign club for 700,000?
Yeah, I always found it interesting with MLS now going into South America, buying players for $2, $3, $4 million out of Colombia and Ecuador, when you could probably just buy the club for that much. Luke, what are your thoughts on some of these kind of developing markets? Are those places you guys would look, or is it too challenging to do business in some of these places?
Yeah, we've certainly looked in those markets. Naturally there's this thought, like you just said, like, hey, why buy the talent when you can buy the club? But the problem is, when you look at the vast majority of these clubs around the world, they're hemorrhaging money, right, every single year. So in some cases, you're actually getting these clubs for free in theory, right? But they're losing 2, 5, 10 million every single year. So, you'd have to have, you'll have these examples. There's people on Twitter that say all the time, well, why buy the player when you can just buy the club? Well, you might be able to get the club for the same price as the player, but then you have to pay that every single year in perpetuity, right? So in some of these markets, these clubs are really sort of really just sort of there's no clubs that are being properly run. So it'd be very challenging to run it in a sustainable way. And then just speaking of Turkey in particular, Turkey, as far as I'm aware, the bulk of the clubs are member owned. And so I just don't think it's open at the moment to foreign investment.
Yeah, I think most of the Turkish clubs are losing lots of money as well. We have a question from Rob. We got about 7 minutes left, so if you have any other questions, send them in. We're almost done. Rob asked, there's been a lot of interest in lower divisions, including second divisions in European countries. What about lower than that? He sees potentially English League One as an investment hotbed, or are there other areas? I know the American guys just went into Ipswich in League One. Do you guys see that low of a level being interesting, or is it too small?
I think it depends upon the level of sophistication for the investor. If it's your first football club, investing in a League One English football club is probably not the right decision, because you're going to hemorrhage minimum 2 to 3 million, if not more, until you can figure out how to run the club. However, if you have a track record and you're not in England and you know how to run a football club, that is definitely interesting, because you're going to get in at a low value on an enterprise valued revenue, and it's the best shop window in the world, England. So if you have a recruiting strategy and kind of know what you're doing, it is interesting.
So Jordan, we've sort of resisted going too far down the totem pole for a very simple reason, and that's that beyond a certain level, that there's no data available for these leagues. So, you get really good quality data collection from at the top all the way down to basically second tier around Europe. Now, some third tier as well. England, for example, StatsBomb covers all the leagues, but for the most part, if you look at third tier and below, there's just no information. So, for a group that's looking to capitalize on the data advantage, you're just not able to execute in the same way that you could with second division or above.
Yeah, that makes sense. Ilya, in Germany, you see a handful of big clubs down lower in the food chain. Kaiserslaughter's way down there, I think, in 3 Bundesliga. Do you see the possibility that foreign investment might come in and be interested in those kind of big brands and big clubs, or you think they're too low down the hierarchy right now for that to make sense?
I just wanted to add the third division in Germany, which is fully professional and features a lot of German champions, German cup winners, a lot of tradition. I think almost pre-corona, almost 10,000 spectators in average. So interesting league. The figures are small, so I think there are good opportunities to start a project, and we see now especially German investor groups, targeting these clubs, and we also note that because you also have a lot of traditional clubs from big cities, from big markets in the fourth division in Germany, which are semi or even professional in some cases, and they are. There are also targets of foreign investor groups, at least checking out these clubs. And despite 50+1, it might be easier to enter at this level, and with a relatively low investment to at least have a good chance to go for promotion and create a sustainable model, let's say, because it's also a good platform for developing players, for showcasing players. So there's definitely activity there. Mainly, I said at the moment, German investor groups.
Yeah,
the one thing I would point out for third division Germany and up until this year, third division Spain, the issue is the threat of relegation to the fourth division, because then you get into this void of no automatic promotion. And you get into a lottery where you basically have to fund losses for a period of time until you win the lottery. So Spain has addressed that by restructuring and now having automatic through the third division. But that's definitely one of the risks of third and then ultimately fourth division Germany too.
Yeah. For Luke and Paul, one of the last questions I'll ask is something I get asked a lot is, investment in soccer in North America, right? Whether that's MLS, USL, Liga MX, is that something that's interesting to you guys at all? Or is the model so completely different that it makes no sense at all?
To me, it's not interesting.
Yeah, Paul mentioned earlier acquiring these clubs for 1 times revenue, right? What do MLS clubs trade at? 15 times? Thereabouts. It's not even comparable. So in MLS, you're sort of banking on long-term sort of just a growth in the valuation of the club. When you're spending 15 times revenue, operationally there's not much you're doing because you're investing so much up front and the cash flows are just so tiny. So we sort of think similarly that MLS clubs at the moment, at least, just don't make a ton of sense.
Yeah, I think the last valuations that Sportico had them trading at 12 times revenue, which is just crazy to me as well. I tend to agree with both of you guys. We got about a minute and a half left. Really appreciate all the time that you guys have all taken. Maybe one last question for Paul. I'm sure you're probably tired of everyone trying to compare what you guys are doing to City Football Group, but where do you guys see the long-term vision in terms of what you guys are doing? Is it just more clubs, more markets, finding more arbitrage opportunities with player pool? Like where do you guys see what you guys are doing in 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, it's adding a few more clubs, but the big value creation is all uniform style of play. So we sent in this window 5 players to Barnsley on loan to Denmark. They immediately go in to the same style of play they're playing. We sent a player from Nancy to Ostend, a couple players from Ostend to Nancy. And so this is very traditional in any other industry. You're in the pharmaceutical industry or chemical industry, you're going to get these synergies. And I think that's the aspect that we're most excited about and getting the most return on right now.
Luke, same question for you guys. Where do you see what the project that you guys have in 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, ultimately similar to Paul, seeing the benefits in multi-club ownership, but also realizing that this sort of influx of external investment across Europe has sort of made some of those strategies challenging. So a lot of these clubs just aren't available, or that the buy-sell spread is just so drastic that it becomes challenging to sort of go to those clubs, or they're losing so much money that on an operating basis, it would be a big struggle. So our basic thesis tends to be the same as it's always been, which is to go into these clubs which are run like community assets, but go in and sort of put them on a sustainable basis. And we sort of execute on Toulouse already, and we plan to continue that path in other markets.
Perfect. Well, we're out of time, guys. Paul, Ilya, Luke, thanks so much for taking the time. This was a great discussion, and I'll send it back to the studio.